Today I'm going to show you how to take blood pressure using one of these guys. This is a manual blood pressure cuff and you need to pair it with a stethoscope, but it's a great and cheap alternative to the electronic ones. So if you're planning to go into healthcare or something like that, then I suggest you learn this very important skill, especially when the electronic equipment fails. So first I'm gonna give a little background about what blood pressure is, and then I'll explain and demonstrate how this thing works. So basically blood pressure is the force exerted by the blood onto the walls of its vessels. And it's actually the force that drives blood flow throughout the entire body because fluids move from high pressure to low pressure. So the heart is actually the organ that contracts, and by doing so, it creates the pressure gradient and pressurizes the blood, causing it to move throughout the entire circulatory system. So likewise, there are two different measurements of blood pressure that reflect the state of the heart. There's systolic blood pressure, which represents the pressure that the blood exerts against the arteries when the heart is squeezing and generating this pressure gradient. And there's diastolic blood pressure, which represents the pressure of the blood when the heart is relaxing and not acting upon the vessels. And in a clinical setting, these measurements are often reported together, with the format being systolic/diastolic. And systolic is the higher value, as that's when the heart is contracting and generating pressure, while diastolic is the lower value because that's when the heart is relaxing. So the normal range for blood pressure is below 120 over 80 millimeters of mercury, and anything higher might suggest high blood pressure. So now I'm going to explain to you how exactly this thing works. And I already have the cuff wrapped around my arm, and I have the dial here which displays the pressure of the air inside the cuff, and I have the pump right here which controls the air pressure. So how this thing works is by finding the range of turbulent blood flow in the brachial artery by manipulating the air pressure inside the cuff that surrounds it. So I know that was a lot of fancy words, and I think the best way to explain this is by going over it step by step. So right now there's no air pressure inside the cuff, and my artery is in laminar flow. That means that there's no occlusion because there's no external force pressing against the artery and compressing it, so blood is able to move through pretty freely based on the pressure gradient that my heart pumps. And at this point, no pulse sounds can be heard because there's no blockage for the blood to bounce off of for sounds to be created. So now I'm gonna increase the cuff pressure to a point well beyond my systolic blood pressure, which effectively stops blood flow because now the pressure compressing my brachial artery is much greater than the pressure gradient the heart can provide, aka systolic pressure. So at this point, I basically have no blood flow and it's all stopped. And if I stay in this position for too long, that'll probably have really bad consequences and my arm will go numb. But basically, pulse can't be heard either at this point because there's no pulse because blood isn't flowing through. So now if I release pressure slowly in the cuff to the point where it goes below my systolic blood pressure, I will have achieved turbulent flow in my brachial artery. Maybe like right here. So basically what this means is that now the cuff pressure is below your systolic blood pressure, which means that I've achieved turbulent flow because now there is blood flow through the artery as the systolic blood pressure that the heart generates is able to overpower the surrounding pressure in the cuff that compresses the artery. But because the pressure in the cuff is still high and the two forces oppose each other, this causes partial occlusions in the artery for the blood to bounce off of, and therefore you can hear your pulse using a stethoscope. And you can even feel it in your arm right now. But once I release the cuff pressure to a point below my diastolic blood pressure, I will have achieved laminar flow again, because even when the heart isn't actively pumping, the diastolic blood pressure of my blood when it's relaxing still overpowers the cuff pressure, and that means that the air pressure in the cuff isn't strong enough to create an occlusion at all. So at this point, I'll have achieved laminar flow, and you won't be able to hear any pulse sounds because there's no occlusions for the blood to bounce off of. So that's basically how this blood pressure cuff operates. By fully occluding the brachial artery and stopping blood flow, and then releasing that cuff pressure slowly to find the upper bound of systolic blood pressure, which marks the beginning of turbulent flow, and then releasing it even further to find the lower bound of diastolic pressure, which represents the end of turbulent flow, and once again laminar flow. And the way turbulent flow is detected is through the pulse sounds, aka Korotkoff sounds, which is why you pair the cuff with a stethoscope. Because normally when you palpate your brachial artery, for example, you can feel the pulse, which is just the vibration of the heartbeat carried on by the blood. But without the partial occlusion, there's no obstacle for the blood to bounce off of and further magnify those vibrations, which is why out of all the categories of no blood flow, turbulent blood flow, and laminar blood flow, turbulent flow is the only flow where you can actually hear those Korotkoff sounds, which is how it's detected. So now I'm going to give you a full tutorial on how this thing works. So to set this thing up, first you want to find your brachial artery. It should be in your inner elbow near the bottom side, and to confirm, you palpate it, meaning you press against it with 2 fingers kind of firmly, and if you feel a pulse, then that means you found the right spot. So I already have this thing on, but now you're going to want to slip on the cuff and make sure that it's right above the brachial artery with the arrows pointing towards the artery, and make sure it's tight, but maybe not too tight, maybe leave a little wiggle room. And so now you're going to want to set up the dial to a place where you can see it. For the sake of the video, I'm going to put it right here so you guys can see it. So now you're going to want to set up your stethoscope. So make sure it fits well in your ears, and make sure it's on by giving it a few taps. It should be pretty loud. So you're going to want to press firmly against your brachial artery when using the cuff. And when you press it, make sure you hold it using the sides, because if you press it down like this, then you might accidentally hear the pulse of your own fingers if you press down too hard. So yeah, make sure you're pressing firmly, and then with your free hand, grab the pump. Basically how the pump works is you squeeze it to inflate the cuff, and when you inflate the cuff, make sure you lock it by twisting the knob fully right so no air escapes. And then to release the air, all you gotta do is twist the knob left a little. The more left you turn, the faster it releases. So now that everything's set up, we're gonna actually get started. So you're gonna wanna first turn the knob fully to the right to make sure that no air can escape as you pump it in. So when that's all done, you wanna start pumping air to around 180 millimeters of mercury. Make sure you look at your dial, because that's hopefully well above anyone's systolic blood pressure. And so now that you've reached around 180, what you're going to want to do is slowly release the blood pressure cuff until the air pressure inside is 0. And while you're doing that, you want to make sure you're always listening for the Korotkoff sounds. The first Korotkoff sound you hear will represent your systolic blood pressure, and the last one you hear will represent your diastolic pressure. So let's begin. I'm going to start releasing it, and make sure you're constantly looking at your dial and listening. So obviously you didn't hear what mine sounded like, but I got around 120/70, and I suspect that mine got measured a bit higher than it actually was because I was raising my arm the entire video and I didn't have anything to support it on, so it couldn't rest. But yeah, that's basically how you use a manual blood pressure cuff. It's much harder than using an electronic one, and if you didn't hear anything your first try, then don't worry about it. Keep trying and practicing until you get it. Honestly, using a manual blood pressure cuff is a very complicated skill, because not only do you have to know how to get the pressures right, but you also have to be able to use a stethoscope properly and actually hear stuff. I remember for me, my first few tries, I couldn't do it at all, and honestly, it took me tens of tries to get it right. So if you got it first try, then good for you, you're a stud, but if you didn't, don't give up and keep practicing. But yeah, that's basically all I got for this video. If you have a question or a comment, please leave it down below. I'd love to know, and as always, I left helpful resources down in the description. But yeah, that's all for this video. I hope you enjoyed. Peace out.